Okay, in this session, we're going to look at the topic of Christian influence in society. I want to start with a story. It's a true story. It does go back a number of years, but it is a very, I think, poignant story which still speaks very much today. And it is about a British journalist. I believe he worked for the BBC, and he was going to produce a television documentary to investigate a claim that we hear, in many Christian circles, basically that, the more Christians there are in a particular place, whether it be a city or a town or in some kind of community, the more Christians there are, the better that society will be, the better that city will be. Because we have this inherent feeling and belief that Christians are good for society. Or the more Christians there are in the UK will be a better place. This kind of idea. So this journalist, who wasn't a non-Christian, he wanted to check this claim out. And so what he did was he took regular church attendance as the indicator of a community being Christianized. And he chose to look at the social demographics of the city of Dallas, which at the time was the most, quote, Christianized city on the planet. So it had, in other words, it had more people per capita in church on a Sunday than any other community, at least in the US.
Yeah.
So what the journalist did, he examined life in Dallas across a number of different areas, looking at various statistics and studies. So he looked at crime, he looked at public safety, he looked at police enforcement, healthcare, hospitals, the number of contagious diseases, the infant mortality rate, homelessness, racism, various social indicators such as these. And then he compared these different indicators and categories with other cities across the country which had significantly less people attending church on a regular basis. And what the study concluded was that Dallas was actually one of the worst cities to live in. The crime, the decrepit social systems, the disease, the discrepancies in the economy and people's sort of material well-being, the racial injustice, all these various things disqualified this community from having an adequate quality of life. So it kind of didn't add up. There were more Christians in this city, but actually looking at all of these different areas across society, it was actually not a very good place. So then the journalist went to a number of respected church leaders in the city. And these were well-established, well-known Christian leaders from major churches. And he presented his findings to them. And he said, well, he asked them the question, so, what do you think about this? The condition of your city, the community, it doesn't look very good. How do you respond to this? And the answer that he got from all of these leaders was essentially the same. And it was this: this is not my concern. I'm a spiritual leader. Just think about this for a moment. Let's take it, you're from Bristol. If something similar had happened in Bristol, and the journalist came to church leaders in Bristol and said, well, Bristol's economy is like this, and homelessness rates and all of these various things wasn't very good. And the church leaders said, well, this is not really relevant to me. I'm a spiritual leader in the city, and this doesn't matter to me. This indicates a major issue that is still apparent in many churches, in many communities, and many nations across our world today. I think what was true in Dallas a number of years ago when this TV documentary was made will also be true in many places around the world, in many cities and towns in our nations.
Yeah.
But these findings should shock us, because what it points to, if church leaders respond, if any Christian responds in this way, it means that they are separating life into two worlds, that which is spiritual, which is what these church leaders often thought, that they obviously thought they were just concerned about the spiritual life of the city, and that which is secular or non-spiritual, which was the economy and the medical care, the health care, all of these other areas that were investigated. So let's come back to this question. The number of Christians, yes, we would theoretically say, well, see, the more Christians there are, the more people who are expressing the life of Jesus, the more people that are bringing God's kingdom into a particular place, then that place should be better. I mean, it should be more honesty, more truth, more kindness, more justice, more fairness, more equality, more freedom, all of these things which we would all happily just talk about. But what is the reality in the places that we live?
So Stuart, that's really, really cool. And it's interesting, you asked about Bristol. And I think in a lot of ways, so I'm sort of Roger Allen to do with Together for Bristol. So that really is, we do have a longing and a vision really to see the whole Christian community helping to spread kingdom of God and love and the justice across the whole of life, across Bristol, sort of transforming Bristol together. And yet, what you're saying would still apply to a lot of people. I did look up that story about Dallas, and as you say, it was from a while ago, and it still applies to a considerable extent. I think it's from about before 2006, something like that. So about 15 years ago, as you're saying, it was a while back. And I think there has been a certain amount of progress in Dallas since then. So if I just say briefly Bristol and then how that links globally, and then out of our global links, I've heard of one or two slightly more encouraging stories from Dallas, if you like now, which shows, that although what you're saying still largely applies, there is progress that's going on. So I'm just painting the other side of the picture for a moment, if that's
good.
Okay.
Yeah.
In Bristol, our heart really, our longing is to work across the churches, across the prayer networks, across all of life, all the spheres, as we call it, the sport, the health, education, family, politics, social action, the arts, media, business and workplace. And so Paul here has been very much involved with the social action over many years now, and it'd be interesting to get some thoughts from Paul once you and I have said our bit. So we'll probably have the first half of it for 20 minutes. Paul, if you want to share stuff later, you're so welcome, and no problem if you don't. But in the social action stuff, there are strands, about 14 different strands, where Christians are wanting to are already making a difference in areas like, addiction support and debt advice and the environment, food poverty, homelessness, working in the prisons and with ex-offenders, working with vulnerable working women, this sort of thing. So I'll come back to that a bit later. But we are also part of something called Gather, and that's something that it seems the Holy Spirit's been doing perhaps over the last 25 years, but more particularly the last 15 years, since that Dallas story, perhaps the last 10 years. And so it seems across about 140 towns and cities across the UK, there's this similar thing that God's doing, Holy Spirit's doing, that what we're talking about today is sort of part of that, really, of trying to move church leaders and the Christians out of that sacred secular divide to having a city vision, not just a vision for their own church or for their own community. And we're part with Gather of something called Movement Day. And that reaches right across the whole world. I've been at a conference there where there were about 3,000 people in New York from 90 countries. So you're hearing from Mumbai and Australia, all over the place, of something that's happening. And there were some folks from Dallas there. So I looked it up. There was something called Movement Day, Dallas. It was launched in 2014. So since the story. And their aims on their website are, okay, eradicating Bible poverty by 2033. So you could say, well, that's spiritual still. Racial reconciliation and unity where the great divide continues. Spiritual transformation in the city. So again, you could say that's a spiritual, where millennials and adults are leaving the church in large numbers, maybe because they think it's irrelevant. But then they're also wanting to battle childhood poverty, which is at about 31% of children living in poverty and food insecurity. They're wanting to transform early childhood education, where 30% of Dallas children in the 3rd grade cannot read at their level. So they do have these wider, that there is shift that's going on, perhaps. And similarly, I think in Bristol, you know, there's a tale of two cities there, where in lots of ways recently it was voted the best city to live in the UK, the kindest city, the happiest city. And yet, as Paul and myself would know, it's actually a tale of two cities. It's one of the worst cities in the UK to be born poor in. 25% child poverty. You might have 50% of children in Lawrence Hill, in child poverty, just 1 kilometre away from the prosperous business district with 17,000 people employed, sort of booming tech businesses there. And you will have the north of the city is pretty affluent, you know, this is a generalization, whereas the south would be more deprived. And actually, we were shocked to find it's the most segregated racially of the 10 UK cities in a study, 10 core cities in a study in 2017. So there is a lot to do. And yet there is this growing movement, as I'll just say about for a minute or two, where, okay, so fairly recently a Christian mayor was elected. He set up a city office. There's a vision for the city to go from that 2 cities to one city vision, a fair, healthy, sustainable city. So I'm just talking of ways in which there's increasingly perhaps a city vision coming through that is perhaps starting to inspire church leaders to see beyond the spiritual, beyond the vision for their own church and for their own sort of community within a mile of their church, sort of thing, which is all good. I'm not knocking that, but this city vision. They set up a city office where you have gatherings of perhaps 200, 250 people, bringing together people from the health spheres, the education sphere, you know, it's a top level people, the business sphere, and across the city. Probably about 10% of the people that I recognize there are from the Christian community. So they're involved. There's a certain yeast that's going on. And the mayor in the city office asks all the different communities to bring offers and asks to that city office. And so far, the Christian community has brought 7 of those. I mean, things like the Bristol Church's winter night shelter, you know, in the most cold 3 months of the year. So you'd have perhaps 16 churches involved, 500 volunteers, or maybe TLG, so transforming lives for good, mentors working with children who are at risk of being kicked out of school, and about 18 churches involved with that. And then there's something called the Bristol Churches City Fund. And that's at the moment has been very much involved in the whole response to COVID-19 and particularly food poverty. So churches are involved in sort of 25 food banks, that the number of food clubs have grown from sort of 5 to 16 over this whole COVID side. And there's been a lot of feedback from council that as a Christian community, we're very much filling a real gap there in the food poverty situation, food security situation in the city. Similarly, you know, they were asking for, I think about 78 emergency fostering parents volunteered from the Christian community to help out over COVID, where elder foster parents would have to be shielding. I think I'm just giving a few little examples there of where the Christian community is starting to see more of a city vision. That could be in Dallas, it could be in Bristol that I know better, so I've spoken a bit more about that. But I would say that out of 250 plus churches, probably only 15 have fully got that. Maybe 50 are really getting it. And so in terms of that vision for the whole Christian community to be bringing transformation across the whole of life, there's some good stuff happening, but we've got a long way to go. So back to you, Stuart.
Well, I appreciate you sharing the positive things, such as
the balance, I suppose,
and some of these other initiatives. And of course, if we look across the Christian spectrum, we will find many good examples, role models of people who are engaging in different spheres across areas of society and life, which is wonderful.
But I think you've got some examples, haven't you, of how the gospel is sort of spreading across the whole world, and how that sort of lacked that influence and societal transformation because it doesn't sort of penetrate the cultural worldview. I mean, like in Africa. So it's not cities, is it? But throughout the world, perhaps.
What these Zoom sessions are aimed at are people who are feeling disempowered. So we can celebrate with the people who are feeling empowered and are setting good examples and role models to inspire others to engage in their areas of influence as well. But for people who feel disempowered, we're really highlighting some of the issues that are behind that, particularly in these early sessions. So we're just beginning to touch on more the spiritual secular divide, which can be a big reason why people don't get empowered into their different callings and into the passions and the gifts that they have. So just taking it, stepping back, maybe at a global level. If we look at Africa, as Roger has mentioned, I mean, Africa is the most Christianized continent in the world. And south of the Sahara is estimated to be around 80% Christian. Whether they're born again or nominal Christians, but that's a kind of a figure that people that do this kind of study and research, they will quote that number. And we know there are hundreds and thousands of churches across Africa, evangelists. It's not a place where it's difficult to hear about the good news of Jesus. But the question would be, what gospel is being proclaimed on the whole? Is it the gospel of salvation, or is it the broader, more comprehensive gospel of the kingdom, which we touched on in previous sessions? So given the number of Christians, the number of churches, the availability of the Bible, the Crusades, and all of these things, we would expect, according to the word of God, that Africa would be a blessed continent because they have, so many believers, so many Christian things happening. But while we could say that nearly every person south of the Sahara in the southern part of Africa has been, quote, reached with the gospel, or at least had the opportunity to hear the gospel, the sad reality is that it has not really made a difference to the African nations. This is a generalized point, of course, but in a general sense, where the gospel has been received. So when we look at the 40 poorest countries in the world, 30 of them are in Africa. There's widespread poverty, there's violence, disease, corruption, injustice, chaos, devastation. Now, yes, we do see those things across the whole planet. But when we focus in on Africa as a continent, we see governments typically have more corruption than other Western governments. There's certainly more poverty, there's more disease, and so on and so forth. So when we look specifically at some African nations, maybe we take Rwanda. Well, this nation experienced revival in recent decades, but at the same time, terrible poverty and even civil war. Uganda, another country that later became the center of that particular revival, has experienced 2 decades of terrible suffering with its economy being destroyed. And so there are terrible, terrible things happening, while at the same time, the church in Uganda being one of the strongest in Africa. And even in certain places, and even where Christians themselves can be involved in the very atrocities that are taking place in the nation. So this begs the question of why is this happening? And what has been recognized, and this is the point I just want to highlight here, is that while Christians in Africa and leaders recognize and acknowledge the missionaries that over decades have come to Africa and brought the gospel, that's been appreciated. They've had a lot of sacrifice. They've even laid down their lives, literally, sometimes in bringing the gospel to Africa. What has been missing many times is that the gospel presented hasn't gone deep enough into the culture. So it hasn't brought about transformation in the culture. It hasn't brought a shift in the worldview in the nation. So Christianity is embraced, people respond, maybe some just adopt Jesus and Christian faith alongside other faiths and religions that they already have. And maybe it changes behavior. So now they start going to church meetings, they start reading the Bible, they start praying and singing Christian songs. And that's all well and good. But for transformation to take place, the gospel has to penetrate deeper into, well, at an individual level, obviously into the heart, to bring that inner change and transformation that results in changing outward behavior. But in a culture and in society, equally, the gospel has to penetrate deep into that culture to bring about lasting change. And so where it doesn't happen, and where the gospel of the kingdom is not preached, then typically what results is that we have lots of Christians, lots of Christian meetings and outward signs of Christianity, but very little fruit in seeing, when Rogers mentioned the yeast, the parable of the yeast and the leaven that Jesus spoke about. If the yeast isn't leavening the whole loaf of society, the whole dough, then that change is only going to be at an individual level or at a shallow, more superficial level. And Africa is an obvious example. A concern I would have as another nation would be China, that is seeing huge, rapid increases in numbers of Christians, but how much is actually getting embedded into the society and really bringing about transformation within the whole breadth of Chinese society.
Yeah, that's good, Stuart. And you know, Africa's close to my own heart. Lived in Zambia, in southern Africa for 6 years. Taught history and development studies there. And actually, while I was there, Zambia was declared a Christian nation by the president. And yet, because I think there hadn't been a gospel of the kingdom, but just of salvation, there wasn't a thought through approach to do with the economy, for example. And so actually the massive influence on the economy at the time of Zambia wasn't from Zambia and from the Christian nation. It was from the World Trade Organization, with structural adjustment programs being imposed from outside. So it's an interesting thing that, we can point at corrupt governments and so on in Africa, and rightfully so. And yet there is this bigger picture behind the poverty that's caused there, where there's the whole global trade injustice, and that so often came from colonial days, where Britain was the most Christian country in the world, arguably at the time, and yet what it was exported was this gospel of salvation. And there was, on the other hand, sort of in the secular world, if you like, exploitation that was going on. So, okay, railways were built, but they were built to the ports so that all the raw materials from Zambia and Africa were taken away from Africa and were exported back to the northern countries, so that we became wealthy by turning those primary products into finished goods and selling them. And it was exploiting and stripping the wealth from Africa. So it's interesting to see that at the time where we were perhaps the most Christian nation in the world, we were using that to exploit. And that's been a sort of a background to trade and debt, even up to now. So I think it's just important to give that bigger global picture as to why there's poverty in Africa. It isn't necessarily it isn't the fault of the Africans necessarily, but that Western gospel that was exported and the Western Christian nation that we were at the time had that divide that allowed those sort of injustices to be taking place as well. In classic books like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and Europe got richer and richer to the wealth we have today. So I think it's just been really encouraging. Again, I tend to always see these things half full, so I want to be real about the way it's far from good, but also just to point at how there has been good stuff, where there have been Christian responses which are more holistic, which are more kingdom and not just salvation. So in Zambia, a great hero there as a missionary would be David Livingstone. So obviously there was health care going on, there was education going on, but he also had a passion and helped to abolish the Arab slave trade, not the transatlantic slave trade, but along the east coast of Africa, the Arab slave trade. And in these last few years, I've worked with Christian Aid, with Tear Fund, those sort of organisations that have got more of a heart around the global justice issues, and to see transformation again. So it is moving away purely from that gospel of salvation to that kingdom as well. So in Uganda, you're talking about Uganda in the sort of around the year 2000 with Drop the Debt and Jubilee 2000. Zambia had a lot of its debt, $40 million of its debt, forgiven out of a forgiveness of sort of $1 billion that was done across the 52 poorest nations. And that was inspired by Christians and inspired by the idea of Jubilee in the Bible. And so it's brilliant to see, I think, 6 to 7 million Ugandan children streaming to school because they could go for free for the first time, and had about 12 different coloured shirts, sort of luminous shirts, really, pinks and greens and whatever, alongside the road as we were travelling along. You see these school kids going to school and coming back to school. There's sort of real hope for the future. I think my final point on this is it's interesting to see Uganda, where there is that gospel of the kingdom approach in aspects where, for example, YWAM there, or AIDS care, education and training, which is ASSET, were taking an approach to AIDS, which then became an example for Africa, where the approach was A, B, C. So it was a biblical approach of abstinence, for A, B, be faithful, or else if you can't be either of those, C is condom. So in sort of sexual issues, to be bringing a more biblical approach, a kingdom approach, if you like, saw AIDS in Africa reduced from 36% to 6%. AIDS in Uganda. And that was used as an example. Unfortunately, again, though, as my final point, Western culture or outside of Africa sort of stepped in and didn't allow that to be spread. And the UN said, no, you can't use A and B. That doesn't go with our Western culture, abstinence and be faithful. We'll only emphasize C. And so they missed the whole point of it there, really. So anyway, so much needs to happen. And I guess we've got about 10 minutes left. So, I mean, Stuart, you may have a thought or two to say back. But Paul, I mean, just to give you a chance, I don't know, obviously, if you don't want to say anything and don't want to contribute more to it, then obviously that's absolutely fine. But it may be that you've got a comment or two. So please feel free if you'd like to at this point, but no pressure to do so if you prefer not.
Yes, well, basically, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I seem to recall, Roger, that we had a conversation about the impact of the gospel, particularly in African countries, some time ago, and concerned about the value of the gospel being proclaimed. So,
yes,
I mean, this is sadly familiar territory. I'm slightly more sceptical than you are about the extent to which churches have actually cottoned on to the gospel of the kingdom as opposed to the gospel of salvation.
Yeah.
I see quite a number of the better churches adopting social action as a good thing to do alongside the core work of the church. I don't see kingdom being proclaimed in the services clearly anywhere, quite honestly. Perhaps you're aware of churches where that happens, but I've been to a number of the good churches and they are clearly not proclaiming this. They are proclaiming a gospel of salvation, and as saved people, we want to express the good stuff that we've got and show the world how wonderful Jesus is and do good works and so on. It's very much the important thing is salvation and it's a relationship with Jesus, and as part of that we've got to work it out in practice as well, which is much better than we're saying we're going to heaven and the rest of the world can go to hell mentality of other churches, but it is still not the gospel of the kingdom.
The fair comment.
So I go to evangelistic events, and I never hear the gospel of the kingdom being proclaimed in evangelistic events. What I hear over and over again, quite explicitly, that why should I be saved? So that you will go to heaven when you die. That is, to all intents and purposes, the only message that we as a church ever proclaim, as far as I can hear. And this is this is not me trying to find problems. This is me trying to find good stuff and failing to locate it.
No, fair comment, Paul. And I think just realistic, chatting to folks who are most involved, even across Bristol, really, where there'll be at least 250 churches. And I think even in just catching whether it's the full gospel of the kingdom, I'm not even saying that, but in terms of having a city vision, as I was saying earlier, maybe 15 churches by now, maybe 50 are well on the way to that. But I overwhelmingly agree that there's such a divide still. And so, Paul, I don't know if there's more you want to say on that, or whether Stuart, whether you want to comment on what Paul's been saying as well. Paul, is there anything more on that for now?
It seems to me that the churches are either struggling or doing reasonably well with what they are doing, but the people outside the church really haven't got any interest at all in what we're talking about and what we're concerned about. They may admire the social action that we're doing, but they don't connect it with the gospel because we don't connect it with the gospel. So there's a vast gulf of irrelevancy between what we are beavering away at and what the world is talking about and concerned about and caring about, and that gulf of irrelevancy, it's down to us to get to bridge it.
Yeah.
And I can't see that by tinkering around the edges, we're going to do that.
No, fair comment, and we're not making that connection between salvation and, if you like, what John Stott would call universal redemption. You know, bringing kingdom of God to every aspect of life, including social action. A lot of churches get the social action by now, but you know, what about all the rest of life? And so there's a way to go on it, isn't there? Probably, Stuart. I don't know if you got.
Well, thanks, Paul, for your comments. Yeah, there are some valid points there, and I think it just highlights again what we are kind of trying to highlight in these sessions and trying to bring some help in addressing. And as Roger just said, the social action, if churches get one area, that tends to be the area that they are moving into, whether it's trying to address poverty or food banks and these kinds of things, which is great. But again, there is so much more potential within the local communities of believers that needs to be released and empowered. So, you know, until we start to see that education is an area that as Christians, we need to be actively and intentionally engaged in, not just for the sake of earning a living, but actually shaping education, getting involved in the debate that goes on in that area. So, yeah, I think the spiritual secular divide is something that we will carry on looking at. The next session, we will go into that in a little more detail, try and unpack that some more, because it is something that is really embedded in evangelical Christianity, and is one of the main reasons why so many believers feel disempowered. Because until we get through, just as we were saying earlier, beneath the surface and start getting a mind shift, a mindset change, then transformation won't take place. So we've got to do what we can to help shift the thinking in terms of the gospel and what the gospel encompasses, so that it becomes more comprehensive, so that a more comprehensive number of believers can actually be empowered and equipped to engage intentionally in kingdom work.
Yeah, and to think Christianly, to think biblically, to get involved in areas like education. So I mean, there are some great Christians involved in education, and we do stuff together across that sphere, and often we'll be praying for them. But as we, for example, 3 times a year towards the start of the term, our core group guys have got a passion to be praying for these folks, and they'll be asking them for their prayer requests, and they'll come back full of very vulnerable, you know, honest of the struggles they're going through. But they'll often say, do you know, you're the only people who are praying for me in education. And often, you know, they aren't being sent out there yet by, if you like, the church leaders or whatever. And whereas they may be being asked to run Sunday school on the Sunday morning, they're not being empowered and equipped and affirmed. Some churches are, and are starting to, and have been doing that, but so many are not. And I suppose, as you're saying, this sacred secular divide is something that we'll look at next session, which is, we always do the first Monday of the month and the third Monday of the month. So I think that's on the 19th of October at 4:30. Yeah. So Stuart, I'm aware we've pretty much run out of time. Paul, brilliant. Thanks for joining us. Stuart, anything more you want to say as we finish now? But goodbye.
Well, the question, Christian influence in society is the church being asked? Does it have a voice? Do people come to the church? And if not, then that really answers the question that we've been looking at today. And we've found that they are increasingly in Bristol and in other places, actually. There is some